Chapter 50 Better Safe Than Sorry. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Back in his room, Daniel was sitting quietly on his bed. In his right hand was the small bottle which contained the healing pills that he and the girl had bought an hour earlier. Through the transparent bottle, Daniel could see 5 pear-sized beads. They had hints of transparency, and a dull white color completely devoid of any sort of shine. This wasn't the first time Daniel had seen a healing pill. The first time was when he had extorted one from one of the young masters of the School of Everlasting Fury, in order to heal the hand of the little girl that one of his goons had hurt. The only difference was the rank of the pill, which, considering the time it took to heal the girl, and the magnitude of the injury it was capable of healing, was a rank 5 healing pill at best. Daniel opened the small bottle, and made one pill roll out of the bottle's neck and on his palm. He then observed it for a few moments. Through his spirit sense, Daniel could feel the healing essence within the bead, but he couldn't quite understand its working. It was similar to the essence sphere within the greenhouse ring that the old alchemist had given him. The essence was there, but he couldn't quite understand how it worked. Therefore, comprehension wasn't possible. To this day, Daniel still hadn't understood the use of that sphere. Of course, differently from the sphere within the greenhouse ring, Daniel had one more way to comprehend the healing essence within the pill. And that was to use it on himself. He only owned 5 healing essences, and each would have a limited effectiveness and use, so he wanted to make the best out of it. After a full minute of being immersed in his thoughts, a satisfied expression appeared on Daniel's face. In his mind, a familiar window was present. Dan Heal. Karmic Systems wielder. Age: 14. Rank: Late rank 4 of martial cultivation, perfect body. Peak rank 4 of spiritual cultivation, perfect connection, karma. 5790. L.RG Weapons Masteries, details, martial arts, details, skills, details, spells, details. Reap what you've sown. Time is precious. LV.4 Reduced cost. LV.4 Second chance. LV.1 System upgrades, details. In just a minute, Daniel had spent almost 20,000 karma points to upgrade Time is Precious and Reduced Cost from level 2 to level 4, and to purchase the first level of Second Chance. At first, he had no intention of purchasing Second Chance. But now that he was alone, and about to enter a tournament that he knew barely anything about, and together with people he knew even less, he decided that an additional layer of survival was better than nothing. Suddenly, on Daniel's hand, an extremely sharp dagger appeared. He rapidly activated Time is Precious, and put the healing pill in his mouth. The next moment, he took a deep breath, and after mustering all the courage he had, he used Through Stone and Steel to stab his forearm, then used Splitting Key to open a huge gash that reached all the way from his elbow to his wrist. Since the moment Daniel had thought about consuming the healing pills, he had been worried that, in case he wasn't injured, the healing essence wouldn't take effect, and therefore, he wouldn't be able to comprehend it. In order to avoid possibly wasting a pill over a failed attempt, Daniel had no choice but to injure himself. Behind his gritted teeth and pained expression, Daniel rapidly swallowed the healing pill. He then focused on the essence which suddenly started to pervade his body. Before the pill could even go down his throat, it decomposed and turned into a dense stream of healing essence. The feeling Daniel had felt at that moment was like drinking a warm glass of milk. But instead of feeling it fill his stomach, Daniel felt the wave of warmth explore his whole body, and after reaching the injured point of his arm, it started to concentrate on the wound. Daniel kept his eyes wide open and observed his open wound carefully. The pain made him clench his teeth tightly, and big drops of sweat had started to form on his forehead. The warmth was now filling his arm completely, and after a few moments, Daniel saw the milky streams of healing essence stretch from his muscles, blood vessels, and skin. Every stream would reach for the opposite side of the wound, and slowly connect the 2 cut-off parts, before pulling them back together, and forcibly healing them to a perfect state. The moment the cut-off parts of his arm were attached back together, the pain was numbed almost completely. The whole process had only taken 90 seconds, as the curative power of a rank 7 healing pill was too high when used on a wound as easy to heal as a flesh wound. What Daniel had just did, was the equivalent of asking the best doctor in the world to heal a scratched knee. It was an immense waste of resources, but it didn't come without any rewards. Thanks to the fourth level of Time is Precious, Daniel had managed to comprehend healing essence's workings at an impressive speed. In fact, from the use of a single healing pill, he had been able to learn how to turn his spiritual essence into healing essence of the lowest level, and that was the only requirement to be considered a spiritual cultivator with healing skills. His current comprehension of healing essence was now deep enough for him to, had he been an alchemist, create a rank 1 healing pill. What was unfortunate, was the incredible consumption of karma points, which despite the increased level of reduced cost, still decreased by an impressive amount. For the next hour, Daniel's groans and pained growls resounded within his room. When they finally stopped, Daniel had passed out on his bed, completely covered in sweat, next to an empty bottle. Almost 20 hours later, Daniel woke up on his bed. The sheer memory of how he had spent the last hour awake came back to his mind, giving him goosebumps. After getting back up on his feet, Daniel washed up, and left his room. He had slept all the way to the late evening of the day after, so when he left his room, he saw the rest of the group preparing to leave for dinner. In the day Daniel had slept, the group had gotten used to the idea of Heimart being the leader. Heimart, back to his school, had been the leader of his generation of students, so he was used to giving orders and assigning tasks. He also had a good character, and since his faulty habit of cheating presented itself only when betting with his cousin, he was also respected by everyone as an honorable person. The petite girl was the only one he didn't dare give order to. Either because he thought that she wouldn't listen, or because she was more powerful than he was. After all, she had fought with the pirate captain alone, and didn't seem to be in too much of a disadvantage. The members of the group had been sent by him to gather informations about the tournament. Only a few suggestions had been given to them, being them to ask to natives of the island, and to ask to old people. The older the better. Unfortunately, none of them had come back with more informations than the ones they had gotten from the receptionist. At best, a few of them had heard a few rumors regarding the tournament's prize. After a dinner devoid of good news, the group went back to their rooms for the night. Daniel, completely unable to sleep, spent the night practicing the mastery, the sword, and his martial arts. The way the system increased his speed of comprehension still greatly amazed him. An increase that allowed him to perfectly learn and do something that before, he didn't even know existed. All of that in the short span of a few hours. After a full night of practice, Daniel's mastery of splitting ki and through stone and steel had reached a new level. In fact, he was able to expand the reach of the blade by pushing his ki further than the weapon's body. His swordsmanship had also increased to the next level, making him able to parry, counter and nullify an attack with a simple movement of his wrist. This brief training session, along with Time is Precious, had costed him a full 1,000 karma points for a total of 12 hours of practice. It was now the morning of the day before the start of the tournament. Every single cultivator within the clear and dark city were preparing in small and organized groups, or with the companions they had come to begin with. A few more dozen of ships arrived to the island, unloading large crowds of cultivators which promptly invaded every market and shop within the city. The most chaotic day of a decade had started. Fortunately, Heimart had seen this coming, so he had convinced a few members of his group to pack the essentials for the lot of them during the last couple of days. Various fights took places between the numerous parties of cultivators, while the various merchants put the most expensive and high-end items in exhibit, while jacking up the prices of every item within their inventory by many folds. Daniel and the rest of the group spent the day making plans and organizing. The first objective of the tournament was to find the castle of the Clear Mage and Dark Warrior, so the group had decided to split into 3 teams. 2 composed by 4 people, and 1 composed by 3. Heimart and the petite girl, along with two other people, were on one team. Legart and the man with the strange mustache, whose name was Paul, along with two more, were part of the second team. Finally, Daniel guided a team of 3. Once the tournament would start, the 3 would split into 3 different directions, and explore 3 different sections of the island. If one of the teams managed to find the castle, they would communicate its position to the other teams through the use of an item they had bought during the last couple days of preparation. This item was a special piece of metal which could contain a cultivator's key within. This item was called Key Flag. Each of the team leaders, being Daniel, Heigart and Paul, had 2 of these key flags, and on each of them, the key of the 2 other leaders had been imprinted. The moment one of them found the castle, or found themselves in a dire situation, the team leader in possession of the 2 flags, would slowly erase the other's key imprints. The owners of the imprints would naturally feel their key being erased, and would know exactly where to head to. Daniel's team members were a young man at the peak of the 3rd rank of spiritual cultivation, and a girl at the early 4th rank of martial cultivation. According to the rough estimations given by a few officials, whose work was to observe the influx of visitors during the 2 weeks prior to the start of the tournament. This year's participants were around 50,000. Many of these cultivators had come from powerful sects, schools and families within the kingdoms that surrounded the sea, inside which the island was situated. Because of this, the group had expected there to be many feuds between the various groups, which they would attempt to settle during the tournament. After all, once inside the island, the various young masters and mistresses of these powers would only have their own strength to protect themselves, and in case they would be killed, nobody would know for certain who had killed them. This wasn't a problem for Daniel, which being a complete stranger to the area, didn't have to worry that an old enemy would try to settle a score with him. With this thought in mind, he bid farewell to the group, and made his way to his room in order to take one last good night of sleep before the tournament would start. Chapter 51 The tournament begins. You are listening at novelfull.audio. As the first noises of the morning penetrated through the various windows within the city, the many cultivators woke up with a collective thought in their minds. The day which opened the tournament had arrived. For the following hours, once by one, a massive number of cultivators flooded the streets. Since the very moment they found themselves in the open, their eyes moved towards the depths of the island, and stayed glued there. Daniel was the first amongst his group to wake up, and when he left the hotel, the streets were already too crowded to casually walk through. It was 5 in the morning, and according to the informations they had gathered from the natives of the island, 8 o'clock was the time when the island's formation would activate, signaling the start the tournament. Around the city many martial cultivators checked their equipment, while just as many spiritual cultivators focused on trying to put themselves into the right state of mind. One by one, Daniel's group members left the hotel and joined him in the street. So many people, said Legart to his teammates. Heimart looked at the full group, and after catching their attention with a loud and sharp whistle, he said, "Remember the task at hand. Find the castle, avoid confrontation and most importantly, do not die." The group quickly split into the originally decided teams, and after wishing good luck to each other, they separated and went on their way. Daniel's team was composed by himself, a martial cultivator of the 4th rank named Imblin, and a spiritual cultivator at the peak of the 3rd rank, called Roli. Both of them came from a mercenary group within the same kingdom of origin, and the 2 knew each other very well. They had also assisted to Daniel's heroics during the pirate attack, so they didn't doubt his strength one bit. The island had been split into 3 parts between the team. North, South, West and South.East. Daniel's assigned section was the South.Western part of the island. There was a simple reason for that. The South.Western part of the island was the furthermost from the point they were right now, and it had been assigned to their team because of Daniel's flight abilities, which made him the fastest amongst the group. Within the last few days, Daniel had practiced with aerial walk, and had become perfectly capable of carrying 1 or 2 more people with him. At first, he had thought about throwing his teammates into his greenhouse ring, but he discarded the idea, as he didn't know what the effects of showing such an item would be. Unfortunately, Daniel wasn't able to focus on keeping balance for 3 people at the same time, so he had to carry Imlan and Rolly like 2 sacks of potatoes, holding them by their waists. After summoning a powerful stream of wind, Daniel and the 2 flew toward their assigned section of the island. In 2 hours, the 3 had reached the south-western side of the island. Side where the number of cultivators in wait wasn't lower by any means. During the next couple of hours, Daniel and the rest looked at the people who rushed out of the depths of the island. Some were walking casually, while others had relieved expression. The observing cultivators knew that there would still be some people within the island, and seeing them leave now, reminded them of the starting signs of the tournament. At 8 in the morning, the crowd was so silent, that a fly could be heard flying had there been one. Suddenly, a transparent red column appeared in the middle of the island. This column rose higher and higher, until it reached far past the cloud's height. It then stopped growing in height and started to grow in width. At the same time the column expanded, a light blue mist could be seen lingering within it. It expanded at the same speed the column did, completely filling it up. It almost looked like a trapped power was forcibly pushing against its cage from the inside, but instead of breaking out, it simply forced the cage to expand. The column borders approached the edges of the island more and more, as the cultivator started to worry that some of them might not be far enough, and unfortunately, they were right. When the red column approached the shore, everyone beyond the line of the sand was forcibly pushed back, with no exception. Daniel and the others had heard about this column. It was the key that the Dark Warrior had left within the formation. While instead, the light blue-colored mist was the spiritual sense that the clear mage had used to identify the participants' ages. Once the column reached the sand, it suddenly stopped and started to slowly dissipate. Half a minute later, only the mist remained. Within the crowd which surrounded Daniel's team, a group of men clearly older than 20.5, tried to push their way through the pale blue mist. But the moment the mist touched them, a streak of red ki appeared out of nowhere, and crashed against their chest, pushing them back on the shore. Everything they had heard so far had been the truth. The 2-month-long tournament had officially started. Like a warring legion after hearing the blow of a horn, the tens of thousands of cultivators charged into the island, and rapidly went on their way to start to look for the castle. Right now, Daniel could better observe how many groups had been formed, and the biggest in size numbered in the hundreds. These parties either rushed out in a single group, or using the same strategy Heimart's group used, split and went to check different sections of the island. Some of these groups even started a few skirmishes right after entering the mist. Daniel's intention was to fly in order to gain a certain advantage against others, and then proceed on foot. Another information they had obtained was that the castle had been said to have appeared not only on ground, mountains, and even floating above lakes, but also floating in the air, and burrowed underground. Of course, if the castle had been in the sky, every participant would be easily able to spot it. Therefore there was a common misconception that, during the years when the castle had appeared in the sky, the participants had been exceptionally lucky. But many seemed to forget that flight wasn't a common practice. Even amongst the people of this edition of the tournament, Daniel had seen only a few hundred people roaming the skies, and they were all solitary cultivators. Through various kilometers of forest, valleys and prairies, Daniel flew as fast as his wind currents could take him, and his teammates. Only after reaching the feet of a mountain, he finally stopped. The first thing Daniel wanted to do since entering the island, was to reach the center of his assigned section, and find a secluded place to use as a base. He had stopped at the feet of this mountain because he had noticed a natural cave, whose entrance was covered on all sides. Therefore, the entrance of this cave was observable only by flying cultivators. He would then search the surrounding area thoroughly, explore the lakes, fly above the clouds level, and try to sense underground. 10:32 in the morning. Daniel and the rest of his team had just finished organizing a small camp right at the entrance of the cave. The tournament had started by only 2 hours, and Daniel was about to go make his first scouting attempt, when suddenly, before he could even open his mouth to speak, his head rapidly turned north-east. In that direction, he felt the trace of key he had left in one of the 2 key flags, was being slowly erased. The direction was the middle of the northern section of the island. Area which had been given to Heimart's team to scout. Daniel rapidly turned towards his teammates and said, "I've got the signal from up north. It's almost in the middle of their section." "Already?" asked Imblin with shock in her voice. Finding the castle right away wasn't impossible. In fact, many times the castle had been said to be found within the first few hours of the tournament, as it could appear literally anywhere within the island. Even 30 meters from the shore. Daniel knew that Heimart's team was composed by 3 martial cultivators. Amongst which him and the petite girl, and finally, a spiritual cultivator whose main abilities were summoning and the earth and water elements. Furthermore, he knew for certain that there were no mountains in the northern section of the island. Therefore, if the castle had been found, it could only have been on the ground level, or underground. After rapidly putting their items back in their backpacks, Daniel grabbed his 2 teammates by their waists, and rose up in the air. Heimart's team was at about 200 kilometers from where they were, and at Daniel's maximum flight speed, it would them about an hour to arrive. Northern section of the island. 10.04, 2 hours had passed since the beginning of the tournament, and Heimart's team had made their way towards the middle of their assigned section. Unable to fly, they had been forced to run all the way here, just like most other groups did. At the moment, they were making their way through a large patch of grass, and in the distance, they could see many other groups of cultivators running in the same direction they were going to. 10 minutes later, one by one, the groups were stopped by the appearance of a large lake. The sun was high up in the sky, and directly in the direction they were running to, making its light shine above the surface of the dirty water, and reflected against the cultivators' faces. After more than 2 hours of running, or like in case of Heimart's team's spiritual cultivator, riding a summoned beast, the various groups decided to stop one after the other. Some could be seen setting up camp around the lake, while others ran around its shore, and proceeded past it. This lake happened to be right in the middle of the northern section of the island, so Heimart's group decided to set camp here. The positive side of this place was that it was wide open, and the presence of other groups would discourage malicious participants from sneak attacking during the night. Heimart was currently looking around, and just as he was about to open his mouth and give the first assignments to the team members, he heard a loud scream coming from the shore of the lake, no further than 200 meters away from him. Everyone in the surrounding had heard that scream, and turned to look in the direction it had come from. What met their eyes was the body of a man which was halfway immersed into the lake's water. The only visible part was his chest, arms and head, which rested motionless above the shore. Heimart and a few interested people approached the lying person, and when they noticed the complete absence of blood, their worries slightly eased. One of these people recognized the man's clothes, as he was wearing traditional clothes of his own kingdom. He approached the lying person, and while calling out his name, he put a hand on his shoulder and patted on it lightly. Seeing no response, he clutched his fingers around the man's clothes, and turned his body around, so that it would face up. The face of everyone present at the scene stiffened, as what they saw shocked them deeply. The man's skin was as pale as a pearl, as if completely devoid of blood, but the real shocking detail was that every small bit of the man's tissue which had been immersed in the water, had disappeared. Only his skeleton and clothes remained. "What the hell happened to him?" said one of the cultivators that had witnessed the scene. Another cultivator, unable to look away from the gory scene, responded, "Could the water be corrosive?" Hearing the words of the second cultivator, the deceased's acquaintance pulled the body out of the water, and looked at the parts which had just been immersed the moment he had turned the body around. "The clothes haven't corroded," he said, then lifted up the tissue of his pants, and continued, "Nothing. It's not the water." Various hypotheses come to people's minds, including the possibility of a carnivorous species which inhabited the water. While they were lost in thought, a thick cloud passed in front of the sun, overshadowing its light. It was at that moment that another voice came from not far in the distance. A young woman was standing near the shore, and pointing at the lake, which now didn't have a blinding light reflected on its surface, and said, "What is that?" Everybody turned to look at the direction the woman was pointing at, and what they saw made them forget about the body completely. Heimart, without a second thought, put his hands in his pocket, and started to erase the key within the flags. The reason was simple. Completely submerged by the lake's water. He was currently looking at the clear outline of a castle. Chapter 52 Hostage Situation. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The area suddenly became dead quiet. The large number of cultivators silently observed the submerged castle, while at the same time, they used their key flags to call back their allies. All through the island, many figures were seen suddenly changing their direction at a moment's notice. Action that greatly confused most of the observers. Back to the lake, people didn't immediately enter the lake, as having all assisted to the man's death after he entered the water, they didn't know what dangers it hid. Only a few spiritual cultivators, convinced of being able to avoid the corrosive ability of the water, wanted to try to approach the castle. A small number groups which had at least a spiritual cultivator that had comprehended water essence, started to approach the lake's shore. These groups' plans were basically the same. Create a shield around their bodies, and proceed underwater. One by one, they entered the lake along with their companions. The water started to deviate when reaching too close to their bodies. They then slowly disappeared from people's view. The castle was large and impressive. People believed it to be at least as big as any other kingdom's royal castle. Yet, they could only see the silhouette of its top. And in a far distant point into the water at that. For cultivators, to disappear from sight after entering the murky waters, was expected. "I can take us in," said the spiritual cultivator within Heimart's team. Heimart looked carefully at the murky water, and as he was about to agree, the petite girl stopped him by saying, "It's not only the water. It's something within," in a low voice. The group quietened down once more. Many had been convinced that the strategy used by the spiritual cultivators had worked, so people started to approach other spiritual cultivators to try to convince them into taking them along. Various scenes started to take place. Some promises of wealth, some tried to get on their good side, and some others even tried to kidnap cultivators who had a distinctive resemblance to them, so that they could use them as bargaining chip for a safe passage. But the most common scene was for groups to find the faintest excuse to exterminate a spiritual cultivator's party, and then promise them to spare the spiritual cultivators' lives in exchange for being taken into the castle. Unfortunately for Heimart's group, many had witnessed the scene of how the spiritual cultivator of his team had traveled until here by riding on the back of a summoned elemental beast made of water essence. Many eyes ended up on them. A well-dressed man approached Heimart's team. On his back were around 15 martial cultivators, and they all wore an attire with similar color and cuts of the well-dressed man. It didn't take long for observers to understand that, this man, for a group to be able to afford sending such a large number of powerful cultivators to participate into the Lost Inheritance tournament, it had to be extremely powerful. The man completely ignored the Heimart, the petite girl, and the third martial cultivator. And while looking at the spiritual cultivator, he said, "We require your assistance in reaching the castle." His tone flat and devoid of any emotion. "I'm afraid I have to refuse, I'm here with my team," responded the spiritual cultivator right away. The well-dressed man looked around, and pretended to only just notice the 3 people within the spiritual cultivator's team. He then said, "A small and pathetic group. Why not come with us? We can protect you even after we enter the castle." Heimart, slightly irritated by the man's words, said, "He has already refused." "Leave it be," with a firm voice. The face of the well-dressed man contorted in excessive disdain and shock, and from behind him, a loud voice shouted, "How dare you address the young master?" His face was filled with rage, as if he had just witnessed the worst crime. He then put his hand on the hilt of his sword. In response, the martial cultivator within Heimart's team, grabbed the pole of his spear, and prepared as a cautionary action. Unfortunately, the group's action was all an act, and a similar response was what they had been waiting for. The moment the martial cultivator's hand wrapped around the spear. "You want to attack the young master? How dare you? Prepare to die!" shouted the same cultivator from behind the well-dressed man. A third party suddenly approached the scene. A powerful-looking cultivator amongst the members of the third group, stepped forward, and while looking at the spiritual cultivator, he said, "We'll support you, in exchange for taking us with you into the castle." His intentions were clearly not directed at Heimart's entire team, but only to him. The group of the well-dressed man unsheathed their weapons in response. They all carried the same type of blade. The leader of the second group looked intently at the young spiritual cultivator and said in a loud voice, "Agree or we'll be on our way." The petite girl and the martial artist within Heimart's team assumed their battle stances, ready to fight at any moment. The situation was becoming very tense. Similar scenes were seen all over, and theirs was just one of the many. In fact, various skirmishes had already started on the large field in front of the lake. Knowing that no word could fix this situation, Heimart's team prepared for battle. The surrounding quietness completely surmounted the sounds of the nearby fights. From behind the well-dressed man, 3 martial cultivators dashed past him and immediately attacked Heimart's team. The rest of the group was carefully watching the second party, as they were afraid they would be as shameless as they were, and intervene in the fight. The 3 martial cultivators were no pushovers. They were all at the 4th rank of martial cultivator, and their fighting abilities were remarkable. Unfortunately, they were neither geniuses or prodigies. Heimart and the petite girl were easily able to overpower their adversaries, while on the other hand, the martial artist of their team, being only a peak rank 3 martial cultivator, was on the losing end. Still trying to find a way out of this mess, the petite girl and Heimart decided not to kill the men. They instead injured them lightly and sent them back to their group. Then aided their companion. Slight surprise could be seen in the well-dressed man's eyes, when he saw his 3 subordinates being so easily defeated. He looked at 6 people amongst his remaining group, and with a nod of his head, he sent them to join the fray. Now facing 2 people at once, Heimart's team was facing a more difficult situation. The petite girl was still holding a slight advantage against her 2 enemies, while Heimart's was only able to fight them to a stalemate. The weak link of the chain was once again the young martial cultivator within their group. After no longer than half a minute, the martial cultivator was on his knees, with the cutting edge of one of the 2 cultivators' blades gently pressed against his neck. Until then, on the other 2 fronts, the battle was going well. The petite girl had managed to injure one of her adversaries, and Heimart had managed to throw a few good punches as well. But alas, the moment they noticed the capture of their companion, they were forced to stop. "Whoa, easy there," said Heimart, as a blade pressed too hard against his neck, and cut his skin lightly. "See? There is no point in going with them. They are not capable of reaching the inheritance," said the well-dressed man to the spiritual cultivator. The leader of the second group, which until now had been observing the fight, interjected by saying, "The offer still stands. Say it and we'll help you out." The spiritual cultivator was now anxious. No matter what words they used to try to convince him. Both of them were threatening him. Either by threatening people he had become friends with, or making leverage on his attachment to his own life. "Well, this is about enough time, isn't it?" said Heimart suddenly. The well-dressed man looked at him and said with an aloof voice, "What for?" Heimart slowly raised his hand, and pointed right next to where the well-dressed man was standing and said, "For him to arrive, of course." The well-dressed man couldn't help but instinctively turn to his left, and there, he saw a young man in simple clothes standing quietly. His face contorted in contempt. He turned back to look at Heimart, and with derision in his voice, he said, "Is he supposed to take you out of your predicament? On Heimart's lips a faint smile appeared, as he said, "It's not my predicament anymore. It's yours." The young man who Heimart was pointing at, was of course, Daniel. Now irritated, the well-dressed man unsheathed his blade, and walked straight towards Daniel. He then made an horizontal slashing motion, trying to directly separate Daniel's head from his body. Unfortunately, only the death noise of the blade swinging through air could be heard. Daniel had lowered his body at the very last moment, and slid right on the man's blind side. In the man's ears, the sound of a calm voice could be heard. It was, "Would you mind telling your goons to let them go?" Embarrassed, the well-dressed man barked furiously, "Or what?" He then twisted his body, swinging his blade in a circular motion in an attempt to cut Daniel's body in half. Once again, the only thing he managed to cut through, was thin air. Daniel was using shadow approach and true motion at the same time. His naturally agile body, along with the partial absence of mistakes in his movement and the quiet and stealthy nature of shadow approach, made him completely unpredictable. "Or I will freeze all the liquids within your body, and turn you into an ice sculpture," said Daniel with a matter-of-fact tone. "Bullshit!" shouted the well-dressed man, but before he could turn around and attack once more, he felt the surrounding temperature drop of several degrees. He looked at his companions in panic, and noticed that none of them was in the same state of discomfort he was. He started to shiver, and his warm moist breath became visible whenever he exhaled. Unable to speak, the well-dressed man started to become paler and paler, as the blood within his body retracted from his arms and legs, and focused on his thorax. Daniel looked at the three martial cultivators which were holding his friends hostage, and said, "Now, you could kill my friends. But that would mean the death of this guy who I assume is your young master. So, if you don't want to take him back inside a set of water vases, I suggest you release them, and be on your way." His tone still matter-of-fact, as if nothing could change anything he had said. Clanked the providential sound of the well-dressed man, now unable to squeeze his fingers around the blade's handle anymore, dropping his weapon on a nearby rock, reached everyone's ears. The three martial cultivators removed their blades from the necks of Heimart's team, and stepped back. Their face filled with worry, and a tiny bit of anger. Daniel stepped away from the well-dressed man, and increased the temperature of the air around him once again. A few of the man's subordinates approached him and kept him from falling. They then walked away from the area while dragging their young master. The leader of the second group noticed Daniel's superb comprehension of water essence, but as he was about to open his mouth and talk, Daniel looked back at him and said, "Can I help you with something?" His tone cold and menacing. The group leader froze in place. Swearing to have felt the surrounding temperature drop by a few degrees, he closed his mouth, shook his head, and walked away with the rest of his group. "Busy couple of hours?" asked Daniel to Heimart while smiling. "Hee. You can say that," Heimart responded. Chapter 53 Two Birds with One Stone. You are listening at novelfull.audio. 2 hours had passed since Daniel had rescued Heimart's team. Enough time for Legart and Paul's team to arrive. The 11 of them were now standing near the shore, observing the water's slow movement. "If it's not corrosion, what do you think it is?" Heimart asked to the masked petite girl. Since the night she had accompanied Daniel, the petite girl had become more talkative. She would still only talk when consulted, and would keep her phrases brief and concise, but at least she wouldn't keep quiet. "I saw movement in the water," she responded with a peaceful tone. After a moment of thinking, Heimart looked at Daniel and asked him, "How many trips would it take you to get us all there?" Daniel didn't respond, as he wasn't sure. Instead, he approached the water and decided to try something. His feet were slowly immersed into the water, as he closed his eyes for a moment. During the next minute, the slow motion of the water turned into rough movement, then waves started to appear on the surface of the water. What was strange, was that these waves went in two opposite directions. They seemed to be moving away from one another. After a minute, the water started to split, stopping only after a 20 meters long crack had been formed. Between the two sides, a clear path at the bottom of the lake had been made. The feat that Daniel had just performed had taken a huge toll on his accumulated spiritual essence. Nonetheless, he was still able to maintain the consumption through the use of time is precious, which was able to speed up the conversion of ki into spiritual essence. Whoa! That's impressive, said Lagarde. He then walked into the crack in the water, and started to admire the still, yet slowly moving walls. Every cultivator present on the scene looked up in astonishment. Being from the various powerful forces amongst the kingdoms all around the sea, they had been able to see many young geniuses. Some even prided themselves to be part of them. But for someone under 20.5 years, to reach such a comprehension of water essence, was beyond their imagination. Water was a difficult essence to comprehend, and its use could barely be considered adequate when put into the perspective of a battle. Most spiritual cultivators focused more on offensive essences like fire and lightning, defensive essences like earth and metal, and essence that could increase their mobility, like wind. While the few spiritual cultivators who had decided to comprehend water's essence, were those who inhabited port cities, often traveled through sea, or that wanted to master it to such a degree, that it would allow them to create ice. Ice was still considered water, as it didn't require the combination of two essences like lava did, and yet, it was still considered one of the best offensive and defensive elements to gain comprehension of. Unfortunately, creating ice required an amazingly high comprehension of water essence. Daniel himself, with a comprehension 200 times faster than that of a normal cultivator, had still taken an entire evening to reach the level of comprehension he was at. Not to mention, that had only been possible thanks to the high-quality samples of essence he had had access to, which made comprehending water essence hundreds of times faster than learning it from a simple body of water, like a lake or a sea. Daniel had only known another young cultivator who was able to use ice magic, and that was Yala. He wasn't aware of how complicated using ice magic was at first, but before he could understand it, he had found out that his spiritual teacher, the old alchemist, was in fact Yala's grandfather. It wasn't strange for her to be able to use it, as she had probably practiced for years, with the help of powerful essence spheres such as the one Daniel had practiced for 5 hours with. The sheer number of cultivators around the lake was huge. Even considering the few of them who had been accompanied into the lake by spiritual cultivators, or those who had managed to find the help of one afterwards. The number of the remaining solitary cultivators and parties was still in the thousands. With a loud voice, Daniel said, "Let's check out the water. If something dangerous hides within, we can rush back." He wanted to make sure nobody would attempt to follow them in, as in case something dangerous happened, he didn't want to have to take care about some freeloader's safety. The group of 11 entered the rift in the water, and started to observe the walls carefully. Unfortunately, the water was too murky to clearly see through. After half an hour of pointless observation, Daniel thought of something. He turned towards Heimart and asked him, "Wait a second. Tell me again, in what state did you find the corpse in?" "No blood. Every bit of tissue had been consumed. Only bones and clothes remained," responded Heimart after thinking it through. Suddenly, a small knife appeared in Daniel's hand. It was one of his throwing knives. Daniel stabbed the extremely sharp end of the knife into his fingertip, then, just as a single drop of blood came out of his hand, the water became darker, and it started to bend out of his control. "Out of the water! Now!" shouted the alarmed Daniel. The group didn't stop to think, and instead, started to run towards the shore. Daniel was only able to create a passage about 20 meters long, so the group had no problem in dashing out. What shocked them, was that the bent part of the water followed them all the way until they got out of the water. Once outside, Daniel gave up on the control over the two walls, which immediately shut close, and instead extracted a small ball of the murky water, and made it fly towards him. Under everybody's eyes, Daniel started to slowly remove the water bit by bit, until only a pearl-like amount remained. He then moved the pearl between his eye and the sun, and looked into it. What Daniel saw inside this small pearl were hundreds of tiny worms, frantically twisting in the small bead of water. One side of the bead was still bent towards Daniel, as if the worms had been trying to push through the water and assault Daniel's bleeding finger. To confirm his theory, he started to move his fingertip around the bead, and as expected, the worms followed. "I know what those are," said someone within the crowd. "Those are sharp-nosed leeches. But they should not be that small." Daniel turned toward the girl who had just talked, and asked her, "What do you know about these things?" The girl immediately answered, "They are voracious creatures. They smell blood in the water from miles away, and are even capable of smelling it out of the water, if nearby. Once found a prey, they not only eat the blood in the water, but they also devour their bodies." Daniel threw the bead of water right back in the lake, and started to think. "What do you want to do?" asked Heimart after a few minutes. After pondering over a few ideas, Daniel looked around and said in a loud voice, "Raise your hand if you have comprehended Earth Essence." Just as he expected, most of the present spiritual cultivator raised their hand. The reason why Daniel had expected this result was because of how common Earth Essence was. In fact, other than being very useful in battle, Earth Essence was so common that it could be trained anywhere there was earth or stones. Once again, in a loud voice, Daniel said, "I'll split the water. And you will make a tunnel at the bottom of the lake." The eyes of the many cultivators present opened wide in surprise. The castle wasn't as close as it seemed. In fact, it was about 3 kilometers into the lake. So far, that it took for the sun to be obscured before someone could barely manage to get a glimpse of it. The spiritual cultivators immediately agreed, but then, a large number of voices started to resound in the air. These voices belonged to the rest of the cultivators. "How are we going to pass? Our group has a spiritual cultivator who knows Earth Essence. If he goes, we want to come too. If we can't come, we won't allow you to pass either." These demands, threats and complaints lasted for a very long time. Daniel could only patiently wait for them to finish while thinking of a way out of this mess. Suddenly, a wicked smile appeared on his face. He raised his hands, and lifted his body a meter above the ground, putting himself above all others, and with the loudest volume he could muster, he shouted, "Silence!" The shouts of the crowd quietened rapidly, until there was silence once again. Daniel took the chance to expose his plan. "If you want to enter the castle, you either comprehend water or earth. Right now." He then paused slightly, before continuing, "or you pay a toll." The crowd was dead silent. Daniel didn't want them to start shouting in outrage once more, so he quickly added 50 gold coins to cross through the tunnel. The price wasn't excessive, as most in the crowd could easily afford it. Yet, a loud voice still reached everyone's ears. "And who should take all that money? We would be working too," said one of the spiritual cultivators which had raised his hand before. Daniel had been prepared for this question. He looked at the man, and said, "I get half, the rest get split between the rest of you." "That's outrageous," said another of the spiritual cultivators. Daniel looked at the second man with disdain and said, "Yes it. Then ask somebody else to open a rift in the water for you. Let's see if he or she will not get drained of spiritual essence within a minute." Once again, he paused for a few moments, then continued, "I've made 100% of the discovery, I've put 100% of the idea, and I'll still make 50% of the work. Getting half of the money is the least." The large crowd immediately shut up. Daniel's logic couldn't be refuted. "What about those who don't have the money to pay the toll?" asked an embarrassed solitary cultivator. Daniel turned towards this man, and said, "Form a line to the side. I'll decide if you can cross for free or not." The crowd was about to explode once more, but before they could say anything, Daniel quickly continued, "If I let you through, then I'll pay half of the toll to the spiritual cultivators that will help with the tunnel, out of my own pocket." Daniel's idea was brilliant. Originally, he wanted everyone to pay 5 gold coins. But after considering it for a bit, he decided to increase the prize to 50 and at the same time, give himself the chance to earn a bit of karma points, by letting those with good karma through for free and refusing those with negative karma. At this point, nobody had anything to say. To those who could afford it, 50 gold coins weren't much for a chance to advance in the Lost Inheritance tournament. So they quickly paid their tolls, and separated themselves from those who couldn't pay. In total, 3,200 people had paid the toll in full. 2,000 people remained who weren't paid for the toll. They stood in line in front of Daniel. Daniel took a quick look at the numbers above these people's heads, and either refused them if they had bad karma, or allowed them through if they had good karma. Many of these peoples had tried various speeches, and some girls had even prepared to seduce Daniel, but in the end, they were dismissed before they could even talk. The whole procedure took almost 4 hours, and in the end, about 4,000 people were allowed passage, while to 1,200 the crossing had been denied. Everyone could see the displeasure in the eyes of those Daniel had refused, but the numbers of the two armies of people were too unbalanced. The remaining 1,200 people could only stay back. In just a few hours, Daniel had earned 80,000 gold coins, and 16,000 karma points. After paying 25 coins for each one of the 800 cultivators he had allowed in, the large treasure chests that Daniel had found inside the captain's spatial bag, were now 60,000 gold coins fuller. With an extremely pleased expression on his face, Daniel turned towards the group of spiritual cultivators, and said, "Let's begin." Chapter 54 Management Problems. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Daniel had managed to assemble a small army of spiritual cultivators. Their job was an easy one. They needed to follow Daniel into the crack he would create in the water, and create a tunnel made of stone. The stone needed to be large enough for a small party to move through. The rest of the cultivators who had been granted passage, would stay on the shore, and guard the construction of the tunnel from the small army of resentful cultivators whose passage had been refused. For as simple as the idea was, there were a few problems. For example, more cultivators had started to approach the lake since Daniel had come up with the plan. Secondly, these cultivators would tend to join the group of refused cultivators, unless granted passage. Daniel only had one choice to solve this problem, and that was to leave someone to the shore, and continue to offer passage in exchange of tolls to the newcomers. Unable to personally presentiate to the selection between those who couldn't pay, Daniel had thought of the perfect person for the job. That person was Legart. Since Daniel had met him, he had noticed that this martial cultivator didn't have the most attentive eye for details. But what he had instead, was an extraordinary ability to distinguish between people of good morale, and not. Proof of this, were the 6 people amongst their group. These people were those who had formed the closest relationship with Legart and Heimart during their traverse to the island, and to Daniel's surprise, they were all people with good karma. For this reason, Daniel had decided to leave Legart and the rest on shore, so that they could collect tolls and protect the construction of the tunnel, which would take about a day. The second problem Daniel had found, was the possibility that one of the participants with a bad karma he had taken money from, would destroy a section of the tunnel right after passing it. That would doom all the people in line behind him to either drown, or be devoured by the many tiny leeches that inhabited the water. Naturally, Daniel would never be able to be everywhere at the same time to repair every damage, and yet, he had thought of a simple solution. He would place a spiritual cultivator who had comprehended Earth every tot meters, so that they could restore any damage to the tunnel as soon as possible. In order to prevent the spiritual cultivators from betraying him and destroying the tunnel, he had thought of 2 additional preemptive measures. First, he would keep all the money collected, and be the last one to enter the tunnel. That meant that, in case any of the spiritual cultivators attempted to destroy the tunnel, the economic interests of every other cultivator around would convince them to intervene. Second, he would place every worker with good karma, and or part of a group, at the last section of the tunnel, as they were those who had the most reasons not to destroy the tunnel. Either for moral reasons, or to protect their teammates. Also, he would allow passage to people with good karma first, so that in case someone tried something, most of the people trapped would be those with a questionable morale and bad karma. It was late evening when the last few details had been set. 2 large camps had been erected in the huge field around the lake. One belonged to the paying, while the other belonged to the rejected. A full day of preparations had passed. It was very early in the morning of the next day, and yet, everyone was wide awake and currently observing Daniel, which was quietly standing at the edge of the lake. He turned towards the group of mages, and said in a loud voice, "Remember, 5 meters large, 2 meters tall. Don't worry about speed of construction, just make it sturdy. I don't want to remind you that if any part breaks, many of you will likely die." With this recommendation, Daniel focused on his job. The next moment, the observing crowd was once again able to see Daniel's mastery of water essence at work. The water split, and a 20 meters long crack formed in the murky waters of the otherwise calm lake. One spiritual cultivator after the other stepped forward, and after turning their spiritual essence into earth essence, they started to build the tunnel. Stones started to raise from all directions, and join into the shape of a large circular tunnel. 1 meter at a time, the underwater tunnel was slowly being built. The construction needed to be completed within 10 meters from Daniel's back, or the water would start to close on the uncompleted tunnel, flooding it entirely. Time passed as the construction steadily proceeded. More than once, Daniel had found dressed skeletons at the bottom of the sea. People he had assumed were part of the groups which had entered along with a spiritual cultivator who used water essence. One time, he had even found a still-living spiritual cultivator. This young man was sitting on the ground, almost completely out of spiritual essence, and in state of shock. Daniel had learned from this man, that he had witnessed how, after one of his teammates slipped on the ground and cut his palm on a sharp stone at the bottom of the lake. The bubble he had created caved in and made him lose control over the surrounding water. He had only been able to focus a bubble around his own body, and when things calmed down, he expanded the bubble once more, and found his team's skeletons right next to him. Once sending him back to the shore from the partially built tunnel, Daniel proceeded with the construction. 2 kilometers from the shore. 15.00 Okay, let's go back. You guys are clearly out of spiritual essence. We can continue later. We don't need daylight for this anyway," said Daniel after noticing a significant reduction in the speed of construction. One by one, the spiritual cultivators entered the tunnel, before Daniel shut the end tightly. The many spiritual cultivators were shocked. Not only was Daniel able to such an impressive level of control over water essence, but he seemed to never get tired as well. With shocked and confused expressions, the group slowly walked back toward the shore. Back to the shore, Daniel immediately noticed something different. Both of the 2 large groups had grown in size. The number of cultivator whose passage was been accepted, was now 4,600, while the number of the rejected group, was close to 2,500. Not to mention, everybody was starting to get tense. Unfortunately, Daniel could do nothing about it, as he couldn't suddenly change his mind about refusing people's passage. Or the paying cultivators might revolt. Or worse, he might be asked to give the money back. The numbers were still different, but if this kept going on, there would be a war as soon as the tunnel would be finished. After 2 hours of rest, Daniel recalled the spiritual cultivators, and went back to complete the construction. Progress weren't made as fast as when they had just started, but the speed had picked up once again. At about 21.00, Daniel and the couple hundred-odd spiritual cultivators, finally found themselves facing the huge, back castle. A large air bubble surrounded the entirety of this castle completely, and this left the many spiritual cultivators with faces filled with awe and greed. Nobody knew more than them what a water bubble like this one meant. Somewhere around the castle, a high-level essence sphere of the wind element was hidden, possible by the clear mage. Finding it, would mean having a chance to reach the comprehension of wind essence to the same level the clear mage did. Of course, that would take them decades, but it was still an amazing opportunity. A very small number of spiritual cultivators decided to give up on their share of the money, and dashed into the castle instead. The rest looked at those few with rage, as they really wanted to do the same, but for one reason or another, they couldn't. With the tunnel now completed, Daniel and the rest walked all the way back to the shore. There, they found something they didn't expect. The two groups of cultivators were in the middle of an all-out war. Thousands of cultivators were engaging each other. One group defended, while the other attacked. One would think that the army with highest numbers would maintain the advantage, but that wasn't the case. Most of the spiritual cultivators had been taken away from the defending group. Only a few flame and wind users had been left to defend along the martial cultivators. On the other hand, the attacking group was aware of their lack of defenses, and attacked relentlessly. Daniel was furious. In front of the completion of the tunnel, most of the rejected cultivators had let go of their humanity, and started to attack in a frenzy state. Hundreds of injured lied on the ground, belonging from each side. Daniel walked across his group's line of defense. Around him, various large spheres of murky water fluctuate in the air while rotating rapidly. Whenever someone tried to attack him, he would send one of the spheres of water to engulf them, and then recall it back to him, leaving behind only their skeleton. "Enough!" shouted Daniel to the top of his lungs, while standing between of the two small armies. The battle stopped for a moment, as his deadliness made him the center of attention. "We have made the tunnel. We decide who uses it. If you want to force your way through, you will have to kill me first." His tone was ice cold. The spheres of murky water started to rotate around his body faster and faster. The expressions of the enemies were conflicted. They couldn't accept that the only reasons they could not proceed in the Lost Inheritance tournament was simply because they couldn't afford a toll, or because of the whims of a brat like Daniel. On the other hand, dying only for the chance to traverse this tunnel wasn't really worth it. In fact, the battle hadn't started because the army of rejected wanted to take control of the tunnel. They understood perfectly that, once inside, any of the spiritual cultivators would be able to make the tunnel collapse. The reason why the war had started was the constant taunting and complaints coming from the army of rejected cultivators. They wanted the permission to pass just like everybody else. Unfortunately for them, the cultivators whose passage had been granted had just the same reasons to follow Daniel's orders. He, along with any other spiritual cultivator under his orders, would easily be able to destroy the tunnel in case they didn't protect it from the non-paying and undesired cultivators. "Here are your two options. We will traverse the tunnel right now, and if you guys want to stop us, none of you will survive this night. Or you think of another way to enter," said Daniel, exploiting the state of mind of the cultivators. He then continued, "You know where the castle is, and there are at least 40,000 more people in the island. Any of them might be able to help you enter it." He then breathed out, and with his loudest tone, he finished by saying, "Die to prevent us from proceeding, or live to find a way to advance yourself." These last few words hit the enemy army right where it hurt. Part of them were already unconvinced about the gains they were fighting for. So, when someone stronger than them explained it in a rational manner, many amongst them understood and retreated quietly from the battle. The remaining cultivators were only 200, and such a small number was too small and irrelevant to pose a threat to Daniel's group. Clearly in a disadvantage, they then retreated as well, leaving the area of the lake. Daniel looked around, and noticed some injured people amongst his group. He couldn't afford to let anyone with a bleeding injury to enter the tunnel, or a large amount of leeches might force a hole in the tunnel, and drown them all. A few injured cultivators with red names caught his eyes. And suddenly an idea came to his mind. "Everyone who needs healing, come here," said Daniel. The group looked at him with admiration, but before long, they heard a few more words that made their opinions of Daniel drop once again. With a big smile on his face, Daniel continued, "I'll decide who won't need to pay me." Chapter 55 The Castle Part 1 You are listening at novelfull.audio. You are starting to get greedy. That's how it's done. Ha ha ha, said Sua inside Daniel's mind. With the newly acquired coin still in his hands, Daniel couldn't help but giggle at Sua's words. He couldn't admit it, but since he had found out how to abuse the system, his first solutions to a matter would always be those that allowed him to earn more. The fact that earning karma went along with helping people out was only a bonus. Once he finished healing the injured, Daniel proceeded to set the spiritual cultivators in position, and then opened the tunnel. Surprisingly, on his way to the other side, nobody created any problem for him. They all quietly crossed through the underwater tunnel, just like they were supposed to do. And so, almost a tenth of the participants of the tournament had finally managed to pass the first obstacle. They all regrouped in the air bubble, just outside of the castle. Not many had an idea of what the next tests would require them to do. So, since they had managed to find the castle this early, many of them started to set tents in the surrounding. They planned to wait and see what others would do. Daniel wasn't one of those people. Since the moment he had entered the tournament, he felt the overwhelming need of competition. He wanted to explore, he wanted to fight. And he wanted to win. Most members of his group thought of it the same way. The only ones who disagreed to rushing into the castle were the martial and spiritual cultivators of Heimart's team, and the two spiritual cultivators of Paul's team. Under Daniel's suggestion, they had decided to join another group which intended to take it slowly, leaving the group with Daniel, the petite girl, Heimart, Legart, Paul, Imblin and finally, Rowley. The seven of them approached the entrance of the castle, and immediately, they felt the stale air coming from inside its semi-open double door. They were not the first people to enter, as some of the teams accompanied by water cultivators had probably managed to reach the castle before them. Not to mention the spiritual cultivators who had defected Daniel's team of tunnel workers. Behind the large black double door was a huge hall. Two large files of columns, which divided the hall into 3 even parts. At the sides of this hall were 4 corridors, while in the opposite side of the door were 2 large sets of stairs that separated until halfway up, then joined again to the second floor. Between these 2 sets of stairs was a dark corridor whose destination was impossible to discern. This hall's roof was made of a large crystal ceiling, while the columns reached all the way up to support what looked like rooms of the second floor. The walls were made of dark stone, and the poor illumination made the place look unearthly. "Does anybody know what we are supposed to do here?" asked Legart all of a sudden, scaring the tense Rowley out of his wits. Paul was the first to respond. "I have heard that we are supposed to find the chambers of the 2 masters. And then, pick an item that truly represented their inheritance, or something like that. Then take the item with us into the treasure room," he said. "Wow. That's good information," said Legart sarcastically. Slightly irritated, Paul responded in an animated manner, "Hey. What do you want me to tell you? It's not like the place is filled with people who passed this test before." Paul made a good point. In fact, the participants who could reach the treasury every decade were no more than a few dozen. And of course, reaching the treasury was not enough to enter, otherwise many every 10 years would have been able to receive the 2 old masters' inheritance by now. The moment Daniel and the rest took a step into the hall, their view turned black and white. Behind them, the door had closed shut, and their companions had disappeared from their view. "Did we shift through space again? I hate when it happens," said Sua in Daniel's head. After hearing Sua's words, Daniel asked him curiously, "What do you mean? We aren't where we were before. Last time I felt like this was when that wrinkled old man threw us into that portal," explained Sua, sounding almost nauseated. Completely devoid of color, the hall looked even more ghastly. The total lack of sound would make a person go mad in time, as not even a slight whiffle of air could be heard moving through the corridors. "I wish Paul mentioned this earlier," Daniel muttered, before entering the first of the 2 corridors on the left side of the hall. Past the first corridor, Daniel entered a small training room. Inside it were 2 men sparring. Calling these two men was a bit of a stretch, as in truth, they were two training dummies. These training dummies were performing the art of the sword and the art of the spear. According to what Daniel had studied, there were no flaws in their movements. And instead of sparring partners, their function appeared to be closer to a demonstration. On the walls to the side of the rooms, various sets of weapons were placed in order, each wall perfectly mirroring the other. On the floor, right in front of the walls covered in weapons, were two small altars, on which two small stone hands grew. One of them was currently holding a simple sword, while the other was holding a spear. The moment Daniel entered the room, the door behind him and on the other side of the room disappeared, while instead, the dummies kept practicing as if nothing had happened. Daniel knew that this room was part of a test. He simply didn't know what the test was about. So he sat on the ground, and observed the two dummies spar. What was interesting, was that the two dummies weren't on a loop. Daniel had now observed them for at least an hour, and yet, they had never repeated the same movement twice. They would always variate their attacks, and defend just as well. Despite of how long he watched, none of the dummies could manage to gain the upper hand against the other. No matter how close to hit a dummy was, the other would always counter perfectly and proceed with the spar. He tried to approach the dummies, but when he got too close to them, the dummies became incorporeal, as if they belonged to another space. He was unable to touch or interact with them. The only real things in the room seemed to be the weapons on the walls, and the two altars. Daniel approached the altars and observed them up close. He immediately noticed that the two weapons weren't originally part of the altars, and that they had been placed there afterwards. He then looked at the walls, and on them, he saw an empty slot on each one. Daniel looked at the corresponding spot on the opposite wall, and sure enough, on the wall behind the altar with the sword, a sword was missing, while on the wall behind the altar with the spear, a spear was missing. A wild guess formed inside Daniel's head. He moved towards the sword altar, and removed the weapon from the stone hand. The moment the stone hand was removed, the sword-wielding dummy disappeared, while the spear-wielding dummy assumed his combat stance, and waited patiently. Another change, was that the spear-wielding dummy had become physical. Oh! I get it now. This is a trial to test my weapon mastery, thought Daniel. Swing! The sound of Daniel's sword being unsheathed could be heard all through the deafening quiet room. He then walked right in front of the dummy, and the moment he entered the circular borders of the training ground, his key was forced at the bottom of his feet and extracted by the floor completely. Daniel's guess had been confirmed. During weapon mastery testing, no martial skills were allowed. The spear-wielding dummy was standing above a black spot on the right side of the arena, while on the other side, was a white spot on which the sword dummy was previously standing. Daniel immediately guessed that he needed to stand on the white spot, in order for the test to begin. He recovered himself from his discombobulated state of having his key forcibly absorbed, and slowly walked above the white spot. The moment his feet ended on the white spot on the ground, a spear thrust almost pierced a hole in his throat. Fortunately, Daniel had sort of expected something like this, so he was able to immediately avoid the attack by sliding to the side of the spear, and slash horizontally against the dummy's stomach. The dummy immediately lowered the body of the spear, and deflected Daniel's attack. It then twisted his arms, and slashed diagonally, trying to hit Daniel's neck. The sparring session went on for a while, and the more time passed, the more shocked Daniel became. No matter how fast he attacked, no matter how rapidly he reacted, or how much fantasy he put into his moves, the dummy would always be slightly better than him. It was at this moment that a sudden realization hit Daniel hard. This wasn't a simple weapon mastery testing room. This was a weapon mastery training room, and most probably, part of the Dark Warrior's legacy. Eager to prove his theory, Daniel activated "Time is Precious" and continued his practice with the dummy. With his ability to learn and train fastened by hundreds of times, Daniel's progress could be seen with a naked eye, and yet, the spear-wielding dummy kept besting him. The smile on Daniel's face grew brilliant, as he made a decision within his mind. 4 days had passed. Inside the training room, Daniel stood still while proudly looking at the sword that stuck out of the dummy's back. He had already noticed the 2 doors that had just appeared on the sides of the room, but he didn't care. He was too excited, as he had just defeated a dummy with whom he had sparred for the past 4 days. After only 4 days, thanks to time is precious, Daniel had accumulated 4.5 years worth of combat experience with the sword. His mastery had reached a point where not even all the books regarding the art of the sword given by the old master at arms could do anything to help him improve. He could feel his ki entering the sword just like he felt it being part of his body. It was an amazing feeling, which made wielding a weapon almost indistinguishable from hand-to-hand combat. For 4 days, Daniel kept changing his sparring partner's weapons, as he wanted to gain experience fighting against the many types of weapons. In his mind, regardless of the tournament's inheritance, this room could possibly be the best place in the castle. Unfortunately, the moment he defeated the dummy, and the doors appeared, all the weapons in the wall, along with the 2 altars, disappeared altogether. This had been a major disappointment for Daniel. He still had many karmic points, and if possible, he would have stayed here and improved his mastery of every weapon. But instead, he was forced to proceed with the tournament like anybody else. Taken by curiosity, Daniel opened the details of his weapon masteries within his profile, and what he saw was that his mastery of double-edged swords had increased to 86%. The gains, just from staying inside one of the 2 masters' training rooms, were simply amazing. But since he was unable to stay here, Daniel decided not to proceed to the second room, and instead went back from where he came from. Now back to the main hall, he crossed it from side to side, and entered the corridor opposite of the one he had just came from. He was a double cultivator, and if he could gain something from both paths of cultivation, he would not miss the chance to do so. After a minute of walking, Daniel found himself into another room. This room was simple, and its walls were made of stone. Inside was a square pyramid of rotating spheres. Underneath these spheres was a small altar with a roundish carving in the middle. The size seemed to be the same as the floating spheres. Chapter 56 The Castle Part 2 You are listening at novelfull.audio. Daniel observed each of these spheres from up close. Inside them, a single wisp of essence could be felt. Fire, water, wood, and various other elemental essences. Daniel had already guessed correctly what this room was for. It was an essence comprehension room. He had also guessed that, once he would put one of these spheres onto the altar, something that would help him comprehend the sphere's element would happen. For as exciting the idea was, he knew that he would only have the chance to learn one of these essences, so he had to choose carefully. There were truly a large number of essences, and if the clear mage had comprehended each of these essences to a similar level the dark warrior had comprehended weapon mastery. It would truly be incredible. One could understand how and why the 2 had become such legendary figures in the area. Not all rank 9 cultivators were the same. After all, aside from the progression of one's rank, the style of life would change a cultivator's success as well. A clear example was the president of Golden Cauldron. Even though he was a rank 9 spiritual cultivator, he had to spend a large number of years in developing his company, and build a reputation as the best alchemist. All the time he had spent doing those 2 things, was time he hadn't been able to spend inside volcanoes, battered by cold winds, or flying in the middle of thunderstorms and around the world. While immersed in his thoughts, the spheres kept rotating quietly. Their pyramidal formation was composed of stratums, and each contained different types of essence. The lowest stratum was the one with the most spheres. These spheres contained elemental mana. Fire, water, wood, metal, wind, lightning and earth were present. Inside the spheres of the second layer, Daniel felt wisps of composed essences. There were only 4 spheres, and their overall intensity was no different than that of any other singular element. The only difference was that their intensity was split into various different essences. These spheres contained magma, storm, quake and nature. Magma was composed of fire, earth and metal, storm was composed of thunder, water and wind, quake was composed by earth and metal, and finally, nature was composed by earth and water. If Daniel's guess was right, by putting one of these four spheres on the altar, he would be able to comprehend various different essences, along with their way of mixing together. But the intensity of the essence would also be decreased. In the third level of the pyramid, two spheres rotated slowly. These two spheres also contained composed elements, but their composition was formed not only by basic essences, but also by their mixes. These two spheres contained sky essence and earth essence. Inside the sky essence sphere, Daniel could feel the presence of wind, water, thunder and the mixes between the three, storm and hurricane. The earth essence, instead, was a composition of metal, water, earth and fire, and their combinations quake in nature. Similar to the second layer, the wisps of essence within these spheres was identical in intensity, and yet, if separated, each individual essence would be so faint, that one would hardly be able to learn anything from them. The last sphere at the top of the pyramid, contained world essence formed by the classic elements, along with any sort of combination between the seven, and their mixes. The feeling that this orb gave Daniel, was the same he had when he walked in the outside world. The singular essences were so faint, that one would need to focus in order to distinguish each of them. So it's a trap, muttered Daniel to himself. Daniel's guess was once again correct. What he meant by trap was tempting cultivators by putting the spheres in a pyramid-shaped form. One would believe that more and higher were better, but that wasn't the way of a spiritual cultivator. The purer an essence was, the easier it was to comprehend. It was a waste to observe and comprehend mixes amongst elements, if in the end, one wouldn't be able to comprehend each element by itself. This pyramid was basically like offering 3 swords to a kid to train with. One is perfect to him. Not too heavy, not too light, perfectly balanced and of the right size. The second is larger but of better quality. Its weight is a bit off and overall, it's slightly hard to swing it. The third sword is enormous and expensive looking, but too hard to hold and useful for nothing more than exposition. There was no doubt in Daniel's mind about which of these spheres would be the most beneficial to him. He extended his arm and interjected the motion of one of the orbs, he then put it immediately on the altar. Everything disappeared. Spheres, altar and walls, nothing was there anymore. The only thing he could see, was a blinding white light that twitched in his eyes. His body became stiff, as electricity gently wandered his body, making his muscles tremble, hair raise and spine shiver. This electric current was gentle, and posed no threat to Daniel. It simply wandered his body, showing him how it propagates inside a human's body and the effects it had. Daniel was excited beyond words. The intensity of lightning essence contained in the sphere he had picked, was weaker than that contained within the essence spheres the old alchemist had lent him, as it lacked a lightning treasure which could bind all the essence into a concentrated state. Nevertheless, he was sure that he could be able to at least reach the same comprehension he had for water and wind essence. The reason was simple. Even though the lightning essence wasn't concentrated, it was omnipresent. In fact, Daniel felt as if he was standing inside a lightning. He immediately activated "Time is Precious" and started to comprehend the lightning essence. The concentration of the essence was not as powerful as that of the wind and water essence spheres, which made comprehension slightly harder for Daniel. On the other hand, his system's ability "Time is Precious" had been upgraded twice since the last time he tried to comprehend an essence, and its effects were doubled. After a full day, Daniel's eyes finally opened to the view of an empty room with gray stone walls. He immediately recognized the room as the one with the pyramid of spheres, which now were missing, along with the altar. 2 doors had appeared, one behind him, and the other in front of him. Daniel closed his eyes once more, then started to emanate a faint veil of spiritual essence from his body. After a moment of focus, this colorless spiritual essence took the shape of hundreds of small bolts of lightning that roamed the surface of his body. Amazing! was the only word that Daniel managed to mutter. A profound mastery of sword and a deep comprehension of lightning essence. Daniel's gains were already more than any other participant could have hoped. After a deep breath, Daniel thought, "All right, let's see what's further down." He then entered the second room. This second room was just as simple as the first one. But instead of a floating pyramid of rotating spheres, there was a set of small tables. Each table was identical, but they all had different characteristics, which associated them with the various basic elements. There was a table whose surfaces danced of a light red shine, one who seemed to be made of plain steel, and another which appeared to be made of dirt. Above these tables were small cages with bars spaced just enough to grant a peek in between, and above each of these cages, a plain-looking orb floated steadily. From between the cage bars, Daniel could see small boxes inside. It didn't require a genius for someone to understand the point of this test. First, comprehension of an essence, then, to test one's abilities. Daniel approached the table from which soft flickering white light emanated. He then put his hand on the orb, and started to push spiritual essence into it. Lastly, he turned the spiritual essence into lightning essence. A small ball of lightning formed within the orb, expanding slowly as time went by. There were no reactions to the orb at first, but then, the more Daniel increased the density of the lightning essence, the more unstable the orb became. In a minute, a crack appeared on its surface, and during the following 5 minutes, the crack expanded in length and width, until finally, the orb shattered into pieces. The moment the orb exploded, the small cage which surrounded the small box, started to slowly dissipate. Daniel reached for the small box, and opened it immediately. Inside, was an bead-sized transparent opal. This opal shined of flickering white lights, which followed the motion of hundreds of tiny lightning bolts. A lightning essence treasure. Daniel was familiar with what an elemental treasure was, as inside one of the books given to him by the old alchemist, he had found one that explained the use of essence treasures. The book also explained how they could be used to enchant weapons, armors, or create essence spheres. This lightning essence treasure could be used to enchant weapons, giving them a paralyzing effect. It could also be used to make a lightning sphere of fairly high quality. Suddenly, something strange caught Daniel's attention. The essence treasure he had obtained was exactly at the same level as the highest state of comprehension he could muster of lightning essence. He then looked around, and found that the rest of the tables were still there. Filled with excitement, he approached the tables whose correspondent essence he had at least a bit of comprehension. He then repeated the process, and started to collect the other essence treasures. A full hour had passed, and in Daniel's hand were 7 items. 3 of these items were of a much higher quality than the rest. The lightning opal from before, a coral which radiated with water essence, and a feather whose barbs kept waving in the air. The remaining 4 treasures were a small ruby with faint fire flickering in it, an orange stone that emanated faint earth essence, a piece of dark brown bark, and finally, an arrowhead made out of pure steel. Daniel put these items in his spatial ring, and left the room from the door that had appeared the moment he had obtained the lightning treasure. After a few minutes of walking, Daniel found himself in another stone room. Inside this stone room, there was nothing but a cushion on the ground, and a small table with a hand carved on the surface. Daniel looked around for a bit, but unable to find anything in the surroundings, he decided to sit on the cushion. He then placed his hand on the hand-shaped carving. Nothing happened. Amitic. These are tests for spiritual cultivators. It must have something to do with spiritual essence, thought Daniel before driving his spiritual essence out of his hand. Suddenly, the small table disappeared, and in its place, a box similar to the previous ones he had seen, had appeared. Daniel quickly opened the box, but what he saw inside wasn't an essence treasure. It was a monster core. What was more surprising to Daniel was that this wasn't a random high-level monster core. Instead, it was a peak rank 4 monster core, which corresponded to his exact stage of spiritual cultivation. He was sure that, if he consumed this core right here and now, he would be able to advance to the 5th rank. The reason why Daniel hadn't advanced to the 5th rank wasn't because he lacked the beast cores, after all his teachers had given him half a hundred of rank 4 beast cores alone. The reason was because he simply hadn't found the chance yet. Once taken the beast core from the box, nothing happened. No door had appeared, and no changes were made to the room. Slightly perplexed, Daniel started to think about the purpose of this test. Luckily, he was an intelligent person. So in less than a minute, a smile of realization appeared on his face as he muttered, "It's talent in cultivating the spirit." Chapter 57 The Castle Part 3 You are listening at novelfull.audio. "It's talent in cultivating the spirit," muttered Daniel in realization. He then sat in a lotus position, and before starting to cultivate, he activated, "Time is precious" once again. The moment the last bit of beast core disappeared, Daniel's session of cultivation had ended. His cultivation had now reached the mid-moderate spiritual synchronization stage, or mid-rank 5. When Daniel opened his eyes, he found himself in the middle of a room filled with books. His first reaction was to take a look around, so he got back up on his feet, but after he turned around, he noticed a very old-looking man sitting at a table, reading a thick book peacefully. At Daniel's attempt to approach him, the old man suddenly shut the book, and said, "What an amazing talent you have. It's only been a few thousand years. Has the world changed this much?" said the old man. This old man's body was completely covered by a large tattered old robe, and a hood hid his face entirely. The only thing that indicated his age was the hoarse voice, and the wrinkly hands which slowly rested on the book's cover. "Who are you?" asked Daniel while sitting on the chair on the other side of the table. The old man pressed his back against the wooden chair, and said, "I shouldn't have come back to this place. Such an obvious mistake." His voice sounded depressed and he couldn't help but sigh every now and then. He seemed to be talking to himself. After a moment, he raised his head and looked at Daniel's face. "You look promising. What happened to you? How are you this powerful at?" "Wait." Shock grew on his covered face, and he jumped up from his chair. He then looked carefully at Daniel, and said, "You are a martial cultivator." His voice became more surprised the more he talked. "How is it possible for you to be here if you are a martial cultivator?" "I am not a martial cultivator. I've passed 3 tests for spiritual cultivators to get here," responded Daniel with as much calm as possible. "You can deny it however much you want, and yet, I can smell your weird ki clearly," said the old man. Before the old man could calm down, his eyebrows arched in sudden realization, and asked, "Are you an anomaly? Or has the nature of ki changed in humans recently? Were you born like this?" One question after the other were thrown at Daniel. Daniel was slightly irritated, as the old man hadn't answered to any of his questions yet. "Hold on a second, can you tell me who you are?" asked Daniel with a louder voice than intended. The old man momentarily stopped talking. He then sat back on his chair, and after what looked like fixing his clothes, he said, "My apologies. I am called the Clear Mage. Weren't you supposed to have ascended to a higher plane reserved for those above the 9th rank?" asked Daniel curiously. From the strange behavior of the old man, right as he finished asking his question, Daniel understood that the old man had no idea of what he was talking about. "I've never ascended past the 9th rank. I started a competition with an old enemy, the Dark Warrior," he said in an explanatory tone. Daniel was utterly confused. He didn't belong to this area, so he wasn't that attached to its history. What he was curious about was how it was possible for such a large number of people's memory to deviate so much from what truly happened. "What was the competition about?" Daniel asked to the old man. The old man's voice became melancholic as he recounted the story of how the feud between him and the Dark Warrior had begun. According to what the old man said, the Clear Mage and the Dark Warrior had been friends at first. But as time passed, the Dark Warrior started to change. His physical superiority started to twist his vision of the world, to make him think that power meant everything in the world. As long as one was powerful enough, then, he had the right to decide the fate of others. At first, the Dark Warrior had started to show no mercy to those who offended him, then he started to kill for mistakes and misunderstandings. It had reached a point where, unable to find another solution, the Clear Mage had decided to terminate their friendship, and swore to himself to stop him from becoming a bigger danger to humanity. After 50 years of constant battles, the Clear Mage had decided to conduct their final battle the day they met in this island. Once arrived, the two battled to a point of near death. The Dark Warrior, at this point of his life, had become a vicious human being, killing for the smallest reason, as if human's life was worth less than the breath spent to pronounce a sentence. But if there was something that the Dark Warrior liked, was a powerful cultivator. That was the reason why, regardless of how many times he had been challenged, he had never managed to bring himself to hate the Clear Mage. Instead of ending their fight with both of their deaths, the two cultivators had decided to trap themselves into a formation, and after thousands of years, they would bet their lives on the nature of the human's heart. The next time a monstrous talent would participate in this tournament, he or she would be able to decide which moral path was the right one. The compassionate one, or the ruthless one. Thousands of years had passed, and someone with a monstrous talent had finally arrived. "I assume you have something to ask me," said Daniel. The old man's hands closed in tight fists, as he said, "Reach the treasury room. On the door, you will find a heart with a sword stabbed in it. Remove the sword, and prove what compassion is to my old enemy. Or twist the sword. Put an end to his life, and prove me that he was right. Wasn't I supposed to reach your chambers, and take something from it with me in the treasury in order to open it?" asked Daniel with a confused face. The old man asked in a dismissive tone, "What chambers? There is nothing important in the second floor, leave it be. Now go, you have something important to accomplish. And if you make the right choice, I'll take you in as my disciple." As he finished talking, without waiting for an answer from Daniel, the old man disappeared. Daniel found himself back in the hall. The doors to the sides had disappeared, and only the door in the middle of the two sets of stairs remained. He stood there, observing the dark corridor at the feet of the flight of stairs. After a good minute, he decided to take a look at the first floor, so he went up the flight of stairs. The moment he reached the first floor, two bluish silhouettes appeared on the hall downstairs. One was a middle-aged man with a broadsword hanging to his waist and a long spear strapped to his back. He also wore what looked like a heavy plate armor. The other was a younger man dressed in a light robe. The middle-aged man seemed to be shouting furiously at the younger man's back, but was ignored. The silhouette of the younger man rushed up the flight of stairs and walked on the right corridor. Back on the first floor, the figure of the middle-aged man sighed in disappointment, and disappeared. Daniel decided to follow the younger man. He walked through the right corridor, and entered the door he had seen the younger man disappear into. Inside this room, there was a single bed in the middle of the room, and nothing else. The wall on the left of the door was covered in scribbles and doodles which Daniel couldn't understand. They didn't seem to be the work of a madman, so Daniel started to observe them closely. The symbols were divided into groups, and some were repeated. They clearly described something, but this very alphabet was unlike any Daniel had glimpsed at. Daniel checked the books inside the old alchemist's ring, but no other language he had found was similar to the one these writings had been written in. He was about to give up, but then, he recognized a slightly varied version of one of the symbols from one of the books. The symbol in the book had sharp angles, and it joined the following one with an undulated line, but it still looked similar. According to this book, this language was ancient and alien to their continent. The symbol was the ancient sign for mana. Thanks to the help of Time is Precious, it took Daniel 20 minutes to memorize and learn this language. He then read the writing in the wall once more. It seemed to read the original with only a crappy translation as reference. The language on the book looked like a much younger and evolved version of the writing on the wall, and to Daniel, it felt like he was translating an ancestor's scripture with the use of a language, whose origin itself originated from this language. Thankfully, Daniel had something that no historian had: the ability to correct his mistakes. He tried to make sense of these symbols, and by process of trial and error, he was able to translate a few symbols per hour. After 10 hours, he had translated about 5% of the words present in the wall. He could understand words and bits, but the more he read, the more appalled he became. The concepts of sacrifice and consumption appeared over and over in the test. And it seemed to be a practice of magic which made use of another cultivator's ki and bodies to strengthen themselves. When Daniel had managed to read through a fourth of the test, 4 more hours later, he turned around and saw a middle-aged man holding his head on the corner of the room. The man was only a silhouette, but from the clothes, Daniel recognized him as the younger man from the previous vision. The middle-aged man stretched his arm, and picked up something from the ground. Daniel saw nothing in the man's hand, but his fingers were hooked around something invisible. The man brought this round and large thing above his head, then, he opened his mouth and stood still for a few minutes. It looked as if he was making something drip into his mouth. When he finished, he threw that what he was holding in the direction of the bed, then, the silhouette disappeared from the room. Daniel walked towards the bed, which was made with large embroidered sheets whose sides reached all the way to the ground. He went down on his knees, then lifted one side of the sheet and looked under the bed. Underneath the bed, he saw a small skull, which from its size, Daniel was sure belonged to a child. Slightly nauseous, Daniel got back up on his feet and returned in front of the wall. It took him another few hours to finish translating the text. The test was a method of cultivation. It was different from spiritual or martial cultivation, as it could be practiced on the side. This method of cultivation described in detail how it was possible to cultivate by absorbing people's ki through direct consumption of their body. Ki was part of the body, and in it, it was omnipresent. The most horrifying detail of this method was that not only did it grant the cultivator to absorb one's ki, but also one's life essence. Life and death essences belonged to living beings. A human would be born with a certain amount of life essence, which the naturally formed death essence would slowly consume, to the point where life essence would be exhausted, leading to a cultivator's natural death. The amount of life essence that one could absorb from consumption of another person was very little. At best, hours of life from consuming an entire body. Unfortunately, there were methods to increase the amount of life essence that could be absorbed. And that was consuming humans with richer life essence. Like newborns and children. The idea that millions of participants had stumbled upon this wall in the past thousands of years shocked Daniel beyond belief. He immediately tried to burn the wall, but unfortunately, he was unable to interact with it in any way. It was as if what he was trying to burn didn't belong to his own time and space. Daniel left the room, and as he was about to explore further, he saw another silhouette. This silhouette was that of a very old man. He was standing in front of the door he had just came from. In his hand was his unsheathed sword, but it seemed like he was unable to bring himself to enter and do what he intended to do. After a good minute, he dropped his sword and fell on his knees. His hand reached for his mouth, which he covered to mask the sound of his sobbing. Chapter 58 The Castle Part 4 You are listening at novelfull.audio. After a few seconds, the silhouette of the old man slowly got up on his feet, and walked all the way to the opposite corridor. Daniel followed him closely as he entered a large and well-decorated room. Once in, the silhouette disappeared. This room contained well-kept furniture, and its walls were covered in paintings. One of them in particular caught Daniel's attention. This painting depicted a family of 3. A father, a mother, and a son. The man in the picture looked extremely serious. His brows furrowed above 2 clear blue eyes, and his blonde hair were short and very well kept, just like a soldier would. He wore an impressive-looking armor, on which a crest had been carved. This crest was similar to the one Daniel had seen in various other places within the castle. From the sword and spear that had been painted by his side and hand, Daniel could guess that that person was the warrior whose silhouette he had followed. Next to him was a beautiful woman. Her hair were long and straight, and she let them flow behind her back. Her smile was wide, and she looked happy. Standing between the two was a kid. This kid's hair were blonde, just like his father, but that was the only trait the two shared. His look was serious and detached, as if staying in pose for the family portrait had been the last of his worries. Of one thing Daniel was certain. This castle was this family's home. What he didn't understand was why he would have so many visions about this armed man and his child. Daniel looked away from the painting, and when he turned around to inspect the room, he noticed the silhouette of the old warrior sitting at his desk. His back was now curved, and he looked completely dispirited. His head moved up and down, and at times he covered it with his hand. As if trying to cover the shame, point at something in the direction of the wall animatedly, or punch the table, as if trying to convey his emotional state along with his words. He was clearly having an animated discussion with someone on the other side of the desk. The conversation went on for a while, and the more they talked, the more dispirited the man became. At a certain point in the discussion, Daniel noticed the man's head turn rapidly towards the direction of the door. Panicked, he swiped his hand on the table, and hid something inside one of the desk's drawers. He then stood up and walked toward door, before suddenly disappearing. Daniel walked towards the desk and started to inspect it. The desk was in perfect conditions, and it didn't seem like the influence of time had any effect on it. He sat in the chair, and opened the drawers one by one. The first of these drawers contained clean sheets of paper, quill pens and bottles of ink, while the second was filled of documents and letters. On these documents and letters, many different wax seals appeared. Daniel had no idea what he was looking for, so he took the large pile of documents out, and started to read through them. Purchase agreements, contracts, agricultural reports, military documents. Daniel spent a full hour going through these documents, but aside from understanding that this family had been a noble and rich one, he couldn't understand the correlation with the visions he had had. Putting the documents back inside the drawer, Daniel tried to remember the scene he had seen, and imitate the old man's actions, but no matter how much he tried, everything led him to the drawers. Daniel opened these drawers and emptied them once again, but still, he found no secret space. It was only when Daniel had decided to remove the drawers altogether to examine them better, that he noticed a vertical part of the desk whose edges didn't match the rest. It was a simple piece of wood who shouldn't have been added separately, and instead should have been carved along with the rest of the desk from the original piece of wood. Daniel removed this piece of wood, and behind it, he found a secret compartment. Inside which, was a rolled-up scroll. After opening the scroll, Daniel read its content. In it, were the instruction for the construction of a large-scale magical trap. Before Daniel could find a way to comprehend the workings of this trap, a blue silhouette entered the room. It was a middle-aged man. His posture was straight, and he looked like a refined and powerful cultivator. Daniel recognized him as the man he had seen in the previous room. But he didn't seem to be in such a terrible state. The man approached the bed, and sat next to it. His back bent forward, and his elbows rested on the edge of the bed. His hands joined together, slightly spaced apart, as if he was holding another person's hand between them. It appeared that he was talking with someone who was lying in bed. The figure suddenly disappeared, leaving the room empty once again. Daniel's attention turned back towards the magical trap, but unfortunately, after 2 full hours, he couldn't understand any of its symbols or words. The language was completely different from that on the other room's wall, and looked just as ancient. The only thing he had managed to read, was the title written in a more relatively recent language, and that title was Purgatory of the Damned. Giving up on the scroll, Daniel left the room and explored the rest of the castle. Unfortunately, nothing else of significance happened. It was only when Daniel decided to go back to the main hall, that he managed to see the appearance of the silhouette. The old armed man was standing straight in the middle of the hall. His expression could not be seen, but he was looking down on something of great importance. Suddenly, a second silhouette barged in from the entrance of the castle. He walked a few meters in, and then stopped while looking left and right. The old man waved his arm, and only then did the second silhouette proceed toward the old man. He stopped once again, exactly 2 meters away from him. He looked down, and put his hand above something solid. His hand stroked this object gently, and before long, he fell on his knees and started to cry above it. 5 long minutes later, the second silhouette, which Daniel had recognized as the young man from the first vision, got back up on his feet, turned to his right, took 1 large step to the right, then turned left, and took 3 more steps. The old man looked at him for a minute, then walked in the opposite spot the middle-aged man was standing at. Together they carefully picked up something from the ground, and started to walk into the dark corridor between the 2 sets of stairs. Daniel followed the 2 silhouettes and entered the corridor. The floor of the corridor was racked, detail which told Daniel that the 2 were going underground. The 2 silhouettes had long disappeared, and Daniel had been walking into the large corridor for 2 minutes, before he found himself standing in front of a large double door. Daniel opened this double door, and entered the room. What was in front of him was a large room. Slightly bigger, but somewhat more ghastly than the main hall. Various sculptures were placed all around the room, and each depicted either a valiant man, or a beautiful woman. On the opposite side of the room, was an enormous double door. Each half of this double door large as a common double door. On it, many images had been carved. Stories of fighting, newly formed alliances and peaceful times. In the middle of this large room, right above a short column of stone, was a small sculpture of a heart being pierced by a sword. The sculpture wasn't oversized, and the measures of the heart and sword were extremely realistic. Daniel approached the sculpture, and when he was just 2 meters away from it, around him, a scene of fighting took place. The 2 silhouettes had appeared once again. At first, they had been standing, quietly observing the large double door. But suddenly, the old man unsheathed his sword, and made it slash horizontally, trying to behead the middle-aged man. The sword had been blocked by something solid, which Daniel was unable to see. The 2 started to fight, and from the looks of it, the middle-aged man was a powerful spiritual cultivator. The older man didn't seem to be alone in this fight, as every now and then, the middle-aged man's attention would be picked by something behind his back. After minutes of fighting, the middle-aged man, now injured, started to shout and point at the old man, and at many other points around him. The figure of the middle-aged man was superimposed to the sculpture of the pierced heart. Quietly, the old man observed the middle-aged man's behavior. The middle-aged man's furious ranting went on for a while, until finally, tired and injured, he calmed down and turned to look back at the large double door. The moment he turned around, the old man approached him slowly from behind, and pierced his sword straight into the man's heart. For a moment, both the sword and the man's heart position were perfectly superimposed to the statue. Realization flashed inside Daniel's mind, when suddenly, he felt the sound of steps coming from behind him. When he turned around, he saw the petite girl. The cemetery of my family. It's beautiful, isn't it? Said the petite girl. Daniel smiled at her and said, it sure was. But I bet it wouldn't look so beautiful if we could really see it. He then paused lightly, and continued, I've met an old man. He tried to convince me to extract the sword from that heart. One of your relatives? He asked. The petite girl approached him and said, one of my family ancestors. She then looked around for a bit, and while looking around, she started to recount the story of her family. According to her family's records, her family had been created by the legendary Clear Mage, a well-known powerful and unique cultivator, which one day, out of the blue, had decided to leave the family to visit his old home, never to come back. Through the tens of thousands of years, many descendants had been sent to look for him, but those who didn't perish during the travel, or didn't fail in the first tests, would either die, or come back with no informations. Each of them, before departing, would create a long-lasting key flag that would inform the family of their state. Thousands of years ago, one of these descendants, not only never came back, but his key flag had remained active until now. This man was one of the most talented individuals ever born within the family, and many had placed high hopes on him. The focus of the search had changed from looking for the clear mage's remains, to looking for this talented individual. They hoped to gain the methods this man had obtained, to allow their family to rise once again. While explaining her story to Daniel, the petite girl slowly got closer to the statue. Before she could approach the statue, she heard Daniel's voice coming from behind her. "You can't free him," he said. She turned towards him with a confused expression, and asked why. Daniel couldn't help but notice the green number above the petite girl's head. He was sure that she had no idea of the real story, but he also didn't know if she would believe him if he told her. Chapter 59 The Castle Part 5 You are listening at Novel Full.audio. The clear mage wasn't who you think he was, Daniel said to the girl. The petite girl looked at him with confusion, and asked, "What do you mean?" Daniel took a deep breath, and started to explain, "The Dark Warrior and Clear Mage weren't a couple of powerful cultivators like the legend says. The version recorded in your family record is more accurate, but a detail is missing. The Dark Warrior was the Clear Mage's father." He then paused for a moment, letting the new information sink in. Still confused, the petite girl asked, "Even if that is true, why shouldn't I free him?" "Because he was an evil practitioner, that's why his father trapped him here," responded Daniel. The girl's brows furrowed underneath her mask, and before she could respond, a third voice resounded in the air. "He is lying," said the old man whom Daniel had previously met in the room filled with books. "I arrived here thousands of years ago, and while in search of our patriarch's inheritance, I've ended up being trapped by the same formation the vile Dark Warrior had used to trap the Clear Mage." He then looked at the petite girl, and said, "Please extract the sword and break the formation. I want to go back home." His tone was pitiful. "The Clear Mage, I presume," said Daniel while looking at the old man. "You know, after all I've seen so far, I've been breaking my brain to figure out a way to destroy this formation, and you with it." "I have no idea what you are talking about," said the old man. Daniel smiled, and continued talking. "I've seen your father's intentions of killing you. More than once. But no matter how many times he tried, he could never really bring himself to do it. Because of your father's love, you were allowed to grow up and develop your sick ideas." While talking, Daniel slowly walked around him, observing the old man's movements and reactions. "You were a talented cultivator. I'll give you that. But your nature couldn't be suppressed, no matter how much you tried. When you found that vicious path of cultivation, you abandoned your humanity, and started your killing spree. Your father hated himself for allowing you to travel the world and indulge in your sick method of cultivation. Stop lying," shouted the old man before looking at the petite girl once again, and saying, "Don't listen to what he is saying. Remember the reason why he is here, why everybody is here. It's his greed, it was the death of your mother," said Daniel. As the old man heard these few words, he immediately looked toward Daniel. "Your father reached a breaking point, and prepared a trap for you. Your mother's death was the only chance he had to get you back home. So after she died, he waited for you to arrive to pay your respects to your late mother," said Daniel with a matter-of-fact tone. The bony hands of the old man shut tightly underneath his large sleeves. "You knew it. Since the moment you've entered this hall, you knew that your father was going to trap you here. So you did something about it. With all the power you had certainly traveled far and wide. There was simply no way that someone like your father could have managed to trap you here. Daniel wasn't exactly sure how the clear mage had managed to avoid being trapped here, so he stopped for a few moments, to allow the old man to respond. "Is this true?" asked the petite girl. The old man turned toward her and said in a scolding voice, "Stop listening to him. He has presented no proofs. He is just talking." Unfortunately, the old man didn't break under pressure. It was only when Daniel involuntarily approached the large double door that he saw a reaction. The old man was sneaking peeks at him from the corner of his eyes. A large grin grew on Daniel's face as he started talking, "Of course. Now I know what happened. It's your mother's casket." A shiver ran down the old man's spine. "The moment you threw yourself at your mother's casket, you've left part of your spirit and consciousness in it. So instead of being simply the target of the formation, you've also become part of it," said Daniel. The old man lifted his hand slowly, and took his hood off. Underneath, was a disgusting half-decomposed face. Yet, on the still relatively intact part of his face, Daniel could see a large smirk forming. "You are a brilliant young man. I was so close this time. Ha ha ha." The old man didn't seem to be nervous or scared. Instead, he looked like he had just been found out cheating at a simple game of cards. He then straightened his clothes, and as if coming clean with his funny con, he said, "I remember when, tens of thousands years ago, the first one of these idiots came to find me. I reckon he would have failed spectacularly had he not brought a monster with him. That brat was something else. Just like you. So powerful and talented that he managed to destabilize this whole formation." "You. I think he is talking about one of my brothers," said Sua inside Daniel's mind. Daniel looked at the old man and asked, "You don't look scared. I guess you can prevent us from harming you. Might as well tell us how this thing started," said Daniel. "Well, I happen to be only able to enjoy a few conversations per decade, so I don't see why not." The old man then started to recount the story of how the tournament had been created. According to him, the presence of his rogue spirit within the formation had changed it significantly. Every 10 years, the formation would weaken enough to allow him to take partial control over it. The point in time when the clear mage had control of the formation, was when the formation was at its weakest, and during one of these episodes, one of his descendant, accompanied by a cultivator of unbelievable talent, had managed to destabilize the formation enough to make breaking out of the fictitious space possible. When the first of his descendant managed to enter the catacomb, his rogue spirit attempted to take possession of his body. It was doable, but thanks to the help of that unbelievably talented cultivator, he had failed miserably. From that event, he had learned a few things. He could take possession only of his descendants, and he needed people with an unbelievable talent to stress the already defective formation, to allow people into the real catacomb. To those capable of reaching the real catacomb, he would ask to extract the sword from the heart, and free him. Unfortunately, that was easier said than done, as unless an unbelievably cultivator was present to disrupt the formation, none of them would be able to enter the true catacomb, and would be stuck in the fictitious one instead. Unfortunately for him, the amount of talent necessary to obtain that reaction, was something that the creators of the formation hadn't even thought possible, and one of these people, for all he knew, might be born once every hundreds of thousands of years. It didn't take long for an idea to pop into his head. He would send cultivators out in the world to tell the story of the clear mage and dark warrior inheritance, just to attract as many cultivators as possible. Tens of thousands of years passed slowly, until finally, only 4,000 years ago, the ancestor of the petite girl's family managed to reach this place, along with a cultivator of unbelievable talent. The clear mage still wasn't aware of the effects that destroying the formations would have on his rogue spirit and consciousness, so instead of convincing him to extract the sword, the clear mage took control over his descendant's body. Only later did he find out that, removing the soul himself would not work, as the core part of the formation rejected him no matter what body he possessed. For the next 4,000 years, he waited for another occasion. That occasion presented itself with Daniel. A double-path cultivator. We are similar, you and I. We both cultivate two paths, he, said the old man before laughing. He then stopped and continued talking. Now I have a question. What betrayed me? I knew, since the moment I have told you that I would have taken you as my disciple. From your reaction, I was sure that you hadn't believed me. How did you now? Daniel's eyes moved right above the old man's head, above which a number was floating. I can see right through you, he said with a matter-of-fact voice. That number was 1,623,772,167. And it was blood red in color. Well, fair enough. Who am I to understand all the trick a monstrosity like you has in store, said the old man while shrugging. Anyway, I can only kill both of you, and wait for the next time. He then turned toward the petite girl and added, oh, I'll be taking your body as well, he said while parting his rotting lips and showing a set of black teeth. Daniel looked at him and said, wait a second, don't you want to see my last trick? The old man turned towards him, don't play me, brat, I can hear the glasses you're trying to climb on shatter. Nothing is going to save you, he said. On Daniel's face, a large smile grew. Inside his mind, a few windows had opened. Asterisk primary quest started. No rest for the wicked star. Description. Complicate the lives of humans with bad karma. Second objective set. Survive optional. Prevent the death of Alice optional. Kill the clear mage reward. Plus 50,000, plus 5,000, plus 1,500,000, failure. Death. Open approach difficulty. Extreme. Destroy the clear mage's possessed body. Have Alice open the crypt. Destroy the remnant of the clear mage's spirit. Countdown. 54 seconds. Requirements. Rank 7 of martial cultivation or rank 8 of spiritual cultivation, reward plus 200% KP, 150,000/165,000/4, 500,000. Open approach difficulty. Hard. Deactivate the formation. Pierce the Dark Warrior's sword into the heart of the possessed body within 10 seconds. Have Alice open the crypt. Destroy the remnant of the clear mage's spirit. Countdown. 2 minutes 12 seconds. Reward plus 150% KP, 125,000/137, 500/11, 250,000. The old man immediately grabbed the petite girl's neck, but didn't kill her. He required her body, and the better the shape was, the more it would last. Daniel immediately sent a lightning strike against the old man. The hit took away part of the old man's shoulder, but didn't seem to be felt in the slightest. The old man turned around, and sent 100 of ice spikes towards Daniel. The spikes had been created by transforming the clear mage's spiritual essence into the water essence, therefore, they were unable to reach Daniel, which used the statue of the pierced heart as a cover. Once the spikes reached 1 meter from the statue, they turned back into uncontrolled spiritual essence and disappeared into thin hair. Daniel raised his arms from behind the statue, and shouted, "Okay. I surrender." "What are you on about?" said the rotting old man. With a sheepish smile covering his face, Daniel responded, "I said I surrender. I'll destroy the formation and free you. I'd rather leave now, and maybe be rewarded by you. Then die here." The old man's dirty smile resurfaced, then he said, "Very well, but I'm still taking the girl." Daniel shrugged and said, "I honestly don't care." "Chop chop then, I am waiting," said the rotting old man. Daniel moved towards the sword, and with a single motion, he removed it from the heart. The exact moment in which the sword was removed, everyone within the fictitious castle was immediately teleported into the real one. The scene was hundreds of times more terrifying than the previous black and white version. The place was completely covered in bones, and blood had dried everywhere around the place. A few fresh corpses decorated the various rooms. Some had been chopped into pieces, while others had had chunks of flesh bitten off of them. There was even one that was roasting above a fire. The old man took a deep breath, and with an ecstatic face, he couldn't help but groan and say, "Oh." Finally.